When he was at the table with them, he took bread, as we will take bread in a little while. Held it in his hands, gave thanks, and broke it. It was for those two, Cleopas, his partner, the revelation that they needed to restore their faith, to restore the vision of glory that Jesus had been giving to them and to all the other followers along the way before his death. Then he disappeared from their sight. But then, as they shared for a moment in awe, a sense of what had happened to them that day, shared it, having been thrown down into despair, now they were lifted up. Having taken a very long journey out to the village of Emmaus, feeling exhausted, not just by the journey, well, it wasn't so long after all. Suddenly they had energy, and they wanted to tell, and they rushed back. It can't have taken them half as long to return to Jerusalem and to find the disciples, or to return to wherever they were, Bethany perhaps, as we're told here, and to take them back to life, back to where they had been a few days before. And yet, not back, but forwards, because this was a new day. And this day, strange, mysterious, but exciting things had begun to happen. I told the story. And in the middle of it, they were interrupted. He came again, and the other disciples also were able to see. Peace be with you, he said, as we will share his peace later on in the service. Why are you so troubled? What's all this about? Why are you so downcast? What's wrong with you? How foolish, how slow of heart you are to understand. Didn't Jesus have to follow what the prophets had spoken? Didn't he have to suffer in that way? Didn't he say that's what would happen to him? What were you expecting? That his words would turn out not to be true after all? What were you expecting? It was a long journey. Well, long enough. More than 11 kilometres. How long would that take you to walk? It's not long on a bike, but how long would that take you to walk as they were walking? Some time. Maybe a couple of hours. As they walked, the stranger had plenty of opportunity to tell the whole account of God's salvation history through the Bible. From Moses, through the prophets, through the whole history of Israel during that time, through the history of Israel that we find in the books that are not in our Bibles, perhaps. The Apocrypha, the books of the Maccabees, the history of Israel to the present day at that point. There was plenty to tell, and plenty of scriptures which pointed to what was going to happen on that day. Perhaps it also included some of Genesis. What God had intended when the world began, when he started it all and set the wheels in motion. People to live in harmony and peace with one another. There had been setbacks, grave setbacks along the way. But God was a God who didn't let his people down, and God was a God who would lift them up again. The sign of this, Jesus had been lifted up from the tomb. A dead body was brought back to life. And didn't they know that was possible? Hadn't they seen Jesus in Bethany doing just that for Lazarus? So why should this have been so unexpected? And Jesus had told them it would happen. But I don't suppose there is one person alive today who can confidently say, well, if I'd been there, I would have known. We know, don't we, that we would all have been in exactly the same position emotionally as were the disciples on that day. All of them. Not just one or two. On that Friday, they had seen Jesus humiliated, stripped naked and nailed to a cross, hung there to die. It couldn't have been a worse ending. As if to say, here is an ending. We want it to be complete. This is as complete as it gets. Seeing that, there is surely no one who would have the energy or a continued vision to rise above it and say, but no. Jesus said it would be otherwise. It was indeed only at that point, when they recognized him, when they met him, breaking bread, when they met him in the room, when he showed himself to them, the wounds that he had suffered, when they saw that he was moving, that he was alive and he had power. Not a bedraggled, weak victim, but the Christ who was victorious over death. The Christ who would be with them forever, as he promised. The Christ who would give his Spirit to them so they could continue what he had started. In the world in which we live, in 2013, is it not our turn so often to be dragged to the depths, to have hope taken away, to see former visions removed, darkened, clouded over? I've got one example, and that's on the next slide, if you would, Grace. I have the next slide, just one. Right, that was it. I got this from Jane, the one that I mentioned just earlier. She's just been in hospital, and says that she is very grateful for the NHS, the National Health Service, the NHS in Britain, which has been looking after her. But this is a campaign poster which was put out by a group of nurses at the beginning of this year, because they are worried that the National Health Service in Britain, that has served people like Jane, myself, I dare say Hugo, and many others, in fact almost the entire population of Britain from birth to death. The NHS has been a very valuable institution over the last 60 years. But we're worried about it. You can probably think of similar things in your countries and in this country. Though I wouldn't say the health service in Taiwan, because it seems to me wonderful. In Britain, you can go to a doctor with some serious complaint, and the doctor finds you an appointment with a specialist in a hospital. And that could be 6 weeks later. In Taiwan, you can pick your doctor, the specialist you know you need, and you can go straight to that person. You can make an appointment for the same day. And if not with that one, you can find another one in Tainan. The NHS is struggling. But it seemed to me to be a good example of the way that things change in the world. When I was young, my father, who had not long been back from taking his part in the Second World War, he'd actually been in Bengal for a lot of that time, playing his saxophone, entertaining the troops because they found that he was a good instrumentalist. He'd played in band before. So, fortunately, he was out of the front line, though he also served in a medical corps and saw a lot of the victims firsthand. People like him felt, what was this all for? All this devastation, all this pain, these 6 years that they had been through, and in China it had been even longer. In other parts of the world, still there was violence, and Korea had not had its worst time even then. They came back from fighting, from suffering, and said, what are we going to do now? And started to build a vision for their country, for the future. And the National Health Service was one part of that vision. Okay, we can move off that one now because there are other things too. That was part of the vision. A health service which would cater for the needs of every person in the country, no matter how rich or how poor, that they would all be received and attended to by whatever doctors and specialists they needed straight away, without any questions asked as to how much money they had, whether they could afford the treatment, because the treatment would already have been paid for. They had a vision. They had a vision of free education for all children, up to the age of 16. My father had left school when he was 14. They had that vision. They had that vision of the poor being cared for, disabled people being helped, everybody who needed it having what they needed. They had a vision of every worker having enough money for their family to live on, shared with trades unions that were caring organisations, helping those who struggled with difficult work very often. They had that vision for the nation. And the result, first of all, was Winston Churchill, everyone had looked up to as the great leader during the wartime, was not elected to serve as Prime Minister again. His party was pushed aside and they elected a Labour Party, a different party, so that they could move on with a vision of the future and put it into action. And they did. People like my father and my mother were proud of that. They hoped it would last. But then, gradually, I believe the vision got lost. Not in my generation, perhaps, but another generation, going through the 80s, those who were coming through into positions of leadership, gaining wealth, didn't know what their grandparents had done, didn't know anymore what that vision had been, had not been through the horrors of war, had begun to take for granted what they had. Since then, gradually, the health service has been privatised, dismantled, bit by bit. And the government today quietly is threatening to do even more. The Minister of Health is promising doctors that he's going to put more into their hands, into their power. But he has said they must look for private companies to do the ongoing caring work. No longer will it be taken as read that someone who needs care will receive it from the health service. It will have to be paid for. And if you've got a little bit of money, you'll pay that money until you run out, and then maybe you'll be helped by someone else. And it's being put through gradually, bit by bit. Actually, the health service is becoming not what it was. I even remember when I was minister in the suburbs of London in the 1990s, going to a hospital, meeting one of my church members who was a patient there. She'd been in there for a week. And she told me, after a week, one of the nurses had come to her, the nurse in charge of her ward, had come round and looked under her bed. Said, when was it last cleaned? Since I've been in here. You see, that was supposed to be done by a private company. But they weren't being paid enough to do it regularly, every day, as nurses trained by the great Florence Nightingale would have done. It was already starting, more than 20 years ago. The vision had been lost. We can talk about our own countries. We can think about times like that and institutions like that which have changed and not for the better. And we need to share our concerns. We need to know what's happening around us. And as Christians, I believe, we need to be seriously involved. I mentioned a few weeks ago a report that came out from churches in Britain about the way that poor people were being discriminated against in Britain. Discriminated against by words from people who should know better. Spreading the myths that poor people are only poor because they don't do any work. Without saying, it would be nice if they could get work. That would pay them enough. But now the controls are off. Trade unions don't have any power today. It's been taken away from them. They have no power, really, to negotiate. So poor people actually find themselves in poor jobs, and the majority are in casual work. That means not full-time, and so employers can pay them less than the government says is right. They're discriminated against by words, and even words from government ministers. My own MP, Member of Parliament included, and actually he was quoted in the report. An MP, I have to say, who asked me when I went to visit him one time when I went back from Taiwan for a few weeks, asked me because I was concerned about why Britain and other countries were not letting Taiwan become a member of the United Nations. He said to me, well, why would they want to be recognised like that? Why is it so important for them? That man is now a government minister. I keep sending him emails. I haven't had replies to my last two on other issues. Sometimes when we think of issues like these, this country, our own country, other countries, we're tempted to fall into despair. Things can't get any worse, we think. And perhaps that's a sign of hope. Okay, if they can't get any worse, they must be able to get better. Weren't the disciples saying that? Things can't get worse. But they were also saying, we don't think they can get better either. They could see no way forward. Not along the path that Jesus had taken them already. Until this day, when Jesus did as he had promised. When God did to him what Jesus had told them would happen, and raised him from the dead. Then the spark came back. Their eyes were opened. That's how they confessed they saw it. Simple thing. Breaking of the bread. Their eyes were opened. Mary, who had been in great distress, crying so she couldn't see through the veil of tears, in a tone that she had heard so many times before, the voice that she knew and loved so well. And her eyes lost their clouds, and she saw. This was the day when once again the disciples began to see. Of course it continued. Thomas wasn't there in the room, so we're told in John's Gospel. Thomas wasn't there on that day, but he came and he was with them again the next week. And he was able to see. Not because he touched. Jesus said, "Come, Thomas, come on. You don't believe? You're doubting? Touch. Put your hand into this side where the spear went. Feel the wound. It's still there." Thomas didn't need that. "My Lord and my God," he said. And if those aren't words of faith, I don't know what would be. We have seen through the eyes of the disciples. We have heard through their voices speaking through the ages. There is still room for doubt. And as we tell the accounts of what happened that day, surely the doubts become less. How about you? But when I come to that hymn, which I've sung many times before, we come to the words about breaking of bread. Somehow it chokes me up. And I know that I too am witnessing the presence of Jesus, His resurrection, His life again in my life. And that's what happens when we're receiving communion. Witnesses to the resurrection. Through the symbols of bread and wine. And as that witness takes hold of us, so also the other things of which we may have been despairing become lighter burdens. Jesus is sharing them with us even now. God knows our prayer for the vision to return, for the world to live in peace, for all its people to be fed, for everyone to receive the education they need, to have access to the best of health services that from time to time each one of us needs. Not just those of us who are rich, but the rest as well. The whole world may receive, because Jesus has risen from the dead. Comes to us now to inspire us with a new vision of the world in which He lives and in which we live for His glory's sake. We recognized Him in the breaking of bread. We will do the same. And we'll also see His work being done as we recognize the needs and we pray that the world may be lifted from its despair and its sadness and sorrow to share the resurrection life of Jesus with all his people. In his name, let us give thanks and praise. Amen.